Well, thank you, Tori-san, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be back here in Tokyo and have the opportunity to speak with you about one of the key programs of work that the PRI has been undertaking on TCFD. But I'd really like to start by congratulating Japan on the establishment of the TCFD consortium, because disclosure needs leaders. And on behalf of all international investors, we're really delighted that Japan, during its presidency of the G20, has chosen to step forward on this really important issue. The consortium really provides a background to today's event, which would not have been possible without the great support of our board member, Hiro Mizuno, who's here in the front row and we'll hear from shortly, his team at GPIF, and also our host, Tokyo Stock Exchange. They've really been indispensable partners for us at the PRI, and we really do thank them for all of their support. But in my time today, I'd like to answer really three questions, or try to answer three questions for you. One, why is climate change important to investors? Two being, what have your international peers been doing on TCFD? And the third being, how can investors get started on implementing the task force recommendations? But first, for those of you who might not be familiar with the PRI, just a quick update on who the PRI represents. Sorry, I don't know what's happening to my slides. The PRI is a global investor network with over 2,400 signatories to our 6 principles, and we operate in 50 markets. In Japan, we've got 76 signatories, and since 2015, we've been delighted to count GPIF amongst one of our signatories and have Hiro Mizuno on the PRI board. And PRI continues to add signatories at a rapid rate. Last year we added 350 net new signatories, and we're still growing at approximately 1 new signatory every day. For the purpose of today's discussion, this really provides an illustration of who amongst the institutional investor universe might be thinking about frameworks like the TCFD. The PRI has produced a large body of work over the past 13 years to build awareness about the material implications of ESG risks, and to build networks really for best practice sharing. However, no matter how far we've come in a relatively short space of time, just over a decade, it really just isn't enough, and we have to act faster. The 2019 Global Risk Report from the World Economic Forum identified extreme weather events and failure to mitigate or adapt to climate change as the most likely and the most impactful risks of tomorrow. The climate crisis puts capital at risk. It may be a slow-moving problem relative to other risks that investors face, but the key risk is one of system inertia. The image on the left of the slide is that of hothouse Earth, and it illustrates that while we're arguably just still in control of the problem now, there will come a point when the inertia in the system builds and there is no turning back. We are, as they say, at a tipping point. To avoid this risk, there needs to be deliberate action, and this is the value of the Paris Agreement, a coordinated transition agreed to by over 190 countries, including Japan. The latest IPCC report tells us that if we're going to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees, the globe's current emissions trajectory is dangerously off track, with research indicating that we're heading to well over 3 degrees. So really we have a serious misalignment between ambition and action. And the longer this drift continues, the greater the policy risk for investors, as governments might look to suddenly catch up with the objectives of the Paris Agreement by pulling policy levers. It's our view that this policy jolt is likely to happen in the next 6 years, and that's really within the capex cycle of many industries. And you may agree or you might not agree with this view. However, we would encourage all of you, if you haven't already, to develop your own climate-related view of the future and how you think things are going to play out. For our part, the PRI has already published concept papers on our views of the inevitable policy response, and together with our partners, Energy Transition Advisors and Vivid Economics will be publishing detailed technical analysis and an economic model to help investors understand what this might mean for their portfolios. Financial markets do have the potential to improve our prospects for tackling climate change, but only if we make climate risks and opportunities more transparent. And this is the rationale behind the TCFD. It's a framework developed by the financial industry for the financial industry that will over time translate information about climate change into financial metrics. It's also a flexible framework that recognises that investors will have different starting points in their approach to climate-related risks and opportunities. And regardless of where you are, whether you're just starting, whether you've been doing this for 20 years, there is always an entry point for you with the TCFD. So that was a little bit about the why. Now for the what. The TCFD recommendations are now 2 years old, and I want to spend a few minutes on what PRI signatories, your international peers, have been doing to respond. One measure of this has been the number of investors responding to the PRI climate indicators that are based on the TCFD recommendations, and these were introduced into the PRI reporting framework in January last year. The indicators are not designed to replace the TCFD. Really, it's the opposite that's true. There are means for signatories to get started, to try climate-related reporting and use the outputs to contribute to a public TCFD report. While these indicator questions were voluntary in 2018 and 19, the responses really did exceed our expectations, with almost 500 signatories to the PRI, who represent 42 trillion in assets under management, reporting to the PRI by the end of March. And remembering this was done on a voluntary basis. We thought if we had 100 signatories who did this on a voluntary basis, that would be success. But 500 is a fantastic number. And the graph here shows the breakdown by country and includes Japan. In addition, there were several hundred more who started the indicators but didn't submit them. And whilst this was only a pilot year, again, it does provide an indication of who is thinking about climate risks and are prepared to report to the PRI. We'll be, in the next couple of months, publishing the stats from our 2019 reporting cycle, and that will provide a wealth of more information to our signatories about TCFD. We'll also be producing around 200 investor climate transparency reports from those of our signatories who opted to make their reporting public and share with the rest of the signatory base. Implementation of the recommendation, however, by investors remains largely partial. This slide shows the percentage of PRI signatories reporting to us against each of the 11 TCFD recommendations in 2018. The light blue is asset managers and the dark blue is asset owners. And the graph clearly shows the contrast between the reporting of more narrative governance, strategy and risk management recommendations and the more quantitative climate scenario and metrics recommendations within the TCFD. And it's because of this that PRI stepped up its program on climate scenarios, launching a tool and a number of other publications for signatories that are off the shelf and free for you to use. Analysis of the 2019 reporting cycle will be published shortly, and it'll be interesting to see whether there have been any change to these numbers. Another way to interpret how investors have been responding to TCFD is to cluster them along a leadership staircase that's represented on this slide. And this is what the Bank of England did in its banking sector review of climate risk last year. And there are also parallels for the PRI signatory base. And the four categories here from the bottom are, number one, not yet responding. Two is responsive, and we've defined that as reporting to the PRI on climate-based indicators, but opting to make responses private. The third is responsible, having assigned responsible investment resources to covering climate change, opting to make your responsives to the PRI climate indicators public, but that you don't yet have a multi-year board-approved implementation plan. You haven't published disclosures on climate scenarios or set low-carbon-related targets for your portfolios. And fourth is strategic, so full implementation of the TCFD, a board-approved plan, disclosures and scenarios, and identified and set useful targets. So within the PRI, of course, we recognise that we've got a diverse signatory base, and we expect to have signatories in each of these categories, in each of the 4 areas, with more currently clustered to the left, but we hope to see more moving to the right over time. An example of leadership by an asset owner, where the politics of climate change remains extremely challenging, is Cbus. This is an Australian signatory that represents 47 billion in assets under management. And last year they announced a board-approved multi-year implementation plan for TCFD, which included a goal of full compliance against the recommendations by June 2020 and TCFD reporting targets for all of their fund managers. So having looked at the drivers for TCFD and what international investors have done, let's now look at how investors who are new to the TCFD, and I'm sure that's many of you in the room, can get started. Implementation will not be instant, and there's a lot that needs to be done before preparers get to the reporting stage. Disclosures, in the words of one investor, is the final 10% of the work. We encourage investors to consider a multi-year implementation plan, which starts with securing internal buy-in, assigning responsibility, establishing processes, and building complexity year on year. So let me highlight the key steps in the initial phase. The first step is really to workshop the issue internally. Bring in representatives from multiple teams. For example, bring in the ESG staff together with the risk management staff, portfolio managers and public affairs, as well as consultants and your fund managers, and start to assess the business reasons why the organisation should care about climate change, about why you need to take action, and then to take the outcomes of that discussion to the board. You then need to decide who takes responsibility for this. And in many ways, this might be the hardest step of all. But logic would suggest that it should be the chair of the Risk Management Committee. The board should then assign roles and responsibility for executive oversight of climate-related issues, and then process them and think about which management will start to implement the recommendations. Once there's an agreed position, the organisation is really ready to publish their first TCFD report, starting with the governance and the strategy disclosures. Aiding this implementation has been the publication of a lot of guidance and tools. You're not alone in starting to think about this work. So the PRI, for its part, has published a guide for asset owners, which sets out the actions they need to take. It sets out investor examples, questions for managers, and a chapter on scenarios. We've also partnered with 2 Degree Investing Initiative to launch an online tool that's free for all of you to use, and you can do a whole lot of climate-related scenario analysis by using this tool and by assessing transition risk at the portfolio level. And since the launch, we've seen over 600 of our investors use the tool. So while support for the TCFD continues to grow, there's a pressing need to really accelerate action. And it's our view that there will inevitably be a stronger response from governments on climate change as the gap between the current and manageable trajectory on climate becomes increasingly more apparent. The cost of the solutions fall and civil society unease mounts at the growing frequency of extreme weather events. And we're starting to see that in many places in the world. We're starting to see a lot of civil unrest, people around the world on the streets, on the march, young and old, demanding that governments take more action when it comes to climate change. To minimise the risk of this sudden policy jolt, PRI is encouraging signatories really to take action now on climate change. Don't wait till later. Don't wait until it's too late. And we think that by establishing the governance structures, establishing the internal processes, and a climate-related view of the future, as per the recommendations of the TCFD, of these risks and opportunities, that is really the crucial first step that you need to take. So the TCFD can really help you think through your climate strategy, again, the actions that you'll take. And it's partly because of this we announced in February last year that from next year's reporting cycle for all of the PRI signatories, that reporting against the governance and strategy indicator questions of the TCFD will be a requirement for all PRI signatories. And it's important to note that while it's mandatory to report, it's still voluntary to disclose the information. Again, this is a step change and we're trying to get everybody moving. The indicator questions, guidance and resources are all on our website, and there's plenty of information for PRI signatories. But just in wrapping up, a few points to leave you with are on this slide. But if I can leave people with one overarching message, it's that when it comes to climate risk, unlike the financial crisis of just over a decade ago, we as business, we as the financial community, are not going to be able to say that we didn't know, that we didn't see it coming, and that we didn't have time to act. Because it's not warning that we lack, it's action that we lack. So I really hope the TCFD can be a starting point for many businesses and many investors to take that action. And I really look forward to the discussions today and to hearing what people here in Japan have been doing about driving the TCFD forward and how you're thinking about climate risks within your own organisations. Thank you very much.